At exactly 6:23 a.m. Tehran time on January 8, 2025, something unprecedented happened at Iran's Karg Island oil terminal, the lifeline that pumps 2.3 million barrels daily into global markets. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei personally ordered the complete shutdown of all Iranian oil production facilities as anti-government protests reached the gates of the National Iranian Oil Company headquarters. Within 18 hours, $1.2 trillion worth of Iranian petroleum reserves were completely removed from global energy markets, triggering the most severe energy crisis since the 1973 oil embargo. What I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about global energy security, because this wasn't just Iran protecting its oil infrastructure during civil unrest. This was the weaponization of the world's fourth-largest oil reserves in a desperate attempt to create international economic chaos that would force Western governments to choose between supporting Iranian protesters and preventing global economic collapse. But before I show you the classified intelligence intercepts that prove Iranian officials coordinated this energy blockade with Russia and China to maximize damage to Western economies, before I reveal how Iran's oil shutdown is designed to trigger energy shortages that could bring down European governments, you need to understand how widespread civil unrest in Iran evolved into the most dangerous energy weapon in modern history. The crisis began on December 15, 2024, when anti-government protests in Tehran reached levels not seen since the 1979 revolution. What started as demonstrations against increased fuel prices had evolved into systematic demands for regime change as millions of Iranians took to the streets across every major city demanding the end of clerical rule. But unlike previous protest movements that focused on political reform, the December 2024 uprising explicitly targeted Iran's energy infrastructure as the economic foundation of the regime they sought to overthrow. Protesters occupied refineries in Isfahan, blocked access to drilling sites in Khuzestan, and surrounded government offices of the National Iranian Oil Company in Tehran. The protesters understood that Iran's government derived approximately 60% of its revenue from oil exports, and that disrupting energy production would force the regime to choose between violent suppression that could trigger international intervention or negotiating with opposition forces from a position of economic weakness. But what the protesters didn't anticipate was that Iranian officials would respond to threats against their oil infrastructure by weaponizing that same infrastructure against the global economy in ways that would make continued protests economically impossible for ordinary Iranians to sustain. The decision to shut down Iranian oil production was made during an emergency meeting of Iran's Supreme National Security Council on January 7, 2025. Intelligence intercepts obtained by Western agencies revealed that Iranian officials had concluded that allowing protesters to disrupt oil production would be less damaging than allowing oil revenues to continue funding a government that was losing legitimacy. If we cannot use our oil to maintain power, then we will use our oil to demonstrate that removing us from power will cost the world more than keeping us in power, Supreme Leader Khamenei reportedly told the Security Council. The Americans and Europeans who support these protests will learn that Iranian oil is more important to their economies than Iranian democracy is to their politics. The strategy that Iranian officials developed was elegantly simple and economically devastating. Rather than allow protesters to gradually disrupt oil production through civil unrest, the government would immediately shut down all production while blaming Western governments for supporting protests that threaten global energy security. Iranian state media would announce that oil production had been suspended indefinitely due to security threats created by foreign-sponsored protesters who were attempting to sabotage critical energy infrastructure. International buyers would be told that oil shipments could not resume until the security situation was stabilized through the restoration of government authority. The shutdown would serve multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. It would eliminate the economic disruption that protesters were causing to oil operations while creating international pressure for an end to protests that were threatening global energy supplies. It would demonstrate Iranian capability to influence global markets while providing leverage for negotiations with Western governments about sanctions relief and political recognition. Most importantly, it would shift international attention from Iranian domestic politics to Iranian energy exports, forcing Western governments to prioritize energy security over human rights concerns. The technical implementation of Iran's oil shutdown revealed the sophistication of planning that had gone into weaponizing Iranian energy infrastructure for political purposes. This wasn't a panicked response to civil unrest. This was a carefully orchestrated economic warfare operation that had been developed months in advance. Iranian oil production facilities were shut down in sequence, designed to maximize market impact, while minimizing technical damage to equipment that would need to be restarted once political objectives were achieved. Production wells were sealed using methods that would preserve their productivity while making restart impossible without specialized technical expertise that only government-controlled companies possessed. Refinery operations were suspended through systematic shutdown procedures that would prevent equipment damage while ensuring that restart would require weeks of preparation under ideal conditions. Storage facilities were sealed and secured to prevent any unauthorized access to existing petroleum inventories. Pipeline networks were depressurized and filled with inert gases that would prevent sabotage while making oil transport impossible until government technicians reversed the process. Export terminals were evacuated and shut down using protocols that would protect infrastructure while eliminating any possibility of continued oil exports. The entire Iranian oil industry was essentially placed in suspended animation, protected from physical damage but completely unavailable for commercial production until Iranian officials decided to restart operations. But the most sophisticated aspect of Iran's oil shutdown was the coordination with international partners that would amplify the global impact while providing Iran with alternative revenue sources during the crisis period. Intelligence intercepts revealed that Iranian officials had been coordinating with Russian and Chinese energy companies for months to develop contingency plans for Iranian oil market withdrawal that would benefit all three countries while maximizing damage to Western economies. Russia agreed to increase oil production to partially offset Iranian supply reduction, while selling at premium prices that would generate windfall profits for Russian state energy companies. China agreed to purchase Iranian oil at discount prices through sanctions-evading networks while building strategic reserves that would provide energy security during future crises. The coordination created what economists call a supply shock amplification system, where Iranian production cuts would be partially offset by Russian increases, but the net reduction in global supply would drive prices high enough to generate massive profits for both Russia and China while imposing severe costs on Western countries that lacked alternative suppliers. Iranian officials calculated that oil prices would increase from approximately $75 per barrel to over $150 per barrel within weeks of Iranian supply withdrawal, generating sufficient revenue from reduced production volumes to fund government operations while creating economic pressures in Western countries that would force policy changes regarding Iranian sanctions and political support for protesters. The market response to Iran's oil shutdown was immediate and catastrophic for global energy security. Within 6 hours of the Karg Island terminal shutdown, Brent crude oil prices increased 47%, their largest single-day increase since the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. West Texas Intermediate crude jumped 52%, while heating oil futures increased 61% as traders realized that Iranian supply disruption would create immediate shortages in global markets. But the price increases were just the beginning of consequences that would reshape international politics and economics for months to come. The real crisis emerged as countries realized that Iranian oil shutdown would create physical shortages that couldn't be solved through higher prices or alternative suppliers. Iran typically exported 2.3 million barrels daily to global markets, with approximately 40% going to Asian countries, 30% to European countries, and 30% to other regions including Latin America and Africa. The sudden elimination of Iranian exports created immediate supply shortages in countries that had become dependent on Iranian crude oil for their energy security. South Korea faced immediate shortages that threatened to shut down major industrial facilities within weeks unless alternative suppliers could be identified. Japan confronted similar supply gaps that could force rolling blackouts in major cities during winter heating season. India discovered that Iranian oil shutdowns would require massive imports from other suppliers at premium prices that would strain their foreign currency reserves. European countries faced even more severe consequences because Iranian oil had been flowing through established pipeline networks and refinery systems that were specifically designed for Iranian crude characteristics. Substituting alternative oil suppliers would require technical modifications to refinery equipment that could take months to implement while creating immediate shortages of heating oil and gasoline. Germany's energy minister called emergency meetings with oil company executives to assess supply security as Iranian crude represented approximately 12% of German oil imports. France faced similar vulnerabilities with Iranian oil accounting for 8% of French petroleum consumption. Italy discovered that Iranian supply disruption would force rationing of heating fuel during winter months unless immediate alternative arrangements could be implemented. The supply chain disruptions extended far beyond direct oil imports to include petroleum products, chemicals, and plastics that were manufactured using Iranian crude oil or derived feedstocks. Pharmaceutical companies faced shortages of chemical precursors that were manufactured in Iranian facilities. Fertilizer producers confronted supply gaps that could affect agricultural production throughout the growing season. Most critically, the transportation sector faced immediate fuel shortages as Iranian crude was a significant component of gasoline and diesel fuel production throughout Europe and Asia. Airlines began canceling flights due to jet fuel shortages. Trucking companies reported fuel rationing that could disrupt freight transportation. Shipping companies faced bunker fuel shortages that threatened international cargo movements. The Iranian oil shutdown had transformed from a domestic political crisis into a global economic emergency that required immediate international coordination to prevent widespread energy shortages and economic collapse. But the international response revealed how unprepared Western governments were for energy crises that combined political instability with economic warfare tactics designed to exploit Western energy vulnerabilities. The Biden administration's emergency response included releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, diplomatic outreach to Saudi Arabia and other oil producers for increased production, and coordination with European allies for collective energy security measures. But these responses assumed that Iranian oil shutdown was temporary disruption rather than permanent weaponization of Iranian energy resources for political objectives. American officials initially expected that Iranian oil production would resume within weeks once civil unrest subsided and normal security conditions were restored. They assumed that economic pressures from lost oil revenues would force Iranian officials to prioritize energy exports over political control, but intelligence assessments soon revealed that Iranian officials were prepared to maintain oil production shut down indefinitely while using alternative revenue sources and international partnerships to fund government operations without dependence on oil export income. Chinese purchases of Iranian oil through sanctions-evading networks provided sufficient revenue to fund essential government operations while building Iranian strategic reserves for future emergencies. Russian coordination provided technical expertise and equipment that allowed Iran to maintain oil infrastructure without Western suppliers or services. Most importantly, Iranian officials had calculated that prolonged energy crisis in Western countries would create domestic political pressures that would force policy changes regarding Iranian sanctions and support for anti-government protesters. European governments would face choices between supporting Iranian human rights movements and maintaining energy security for their own populations during winter heating season. The political sustainability of supporting Iranian protesters would decline as European citizens faced energy shortages, increased heating costs, and economic disruption caused by Iranian oil market withdrawal. The strategy was designed to exploit what Iranian strategists viewed as fundamental weakness in Western democratic systems, the inability to sustain international commitments that impose significant economic costs on domestic populations. But the intelligence intercepts also revealed that Iran's energy weapon had been coordinated with broader economic warfare campaign involving Russia and China that was designed to accelerate Western political and economic instability, while the Iranian crisis provided cover and distraction. While global attention focused on Iranian oil shortages, Russia was implementing coordinated natural gas supply disruptions to European countries that supported Ukrainian military aid. China was restricting exports of critical minerals and rare earth elements that were essential for renewable energy systems and electric vehicle production. The three countries were implementing what geopolitical analysts call resource triad warfare, coordinated control over oil, natural gas, and critical minerals that would force Western countries to choose between maintaining international commitments and ensuring domestic energy security. The coordination wasn't coincidental. Iranian, Russian, and Chinese officials had been planning integrated resource warfare strategies since 2022, developing capabilities to weaponize their energy exports and raw material supplies in ways that would maximize economic damage, while maintaining plausible deniability about aggressive intentions. Iran provided oil supply disruption capabilities. Russia provided natural gas supply manipulation. China provided control over renewable energy supply chains and critical mineral exports. Together, they could create energy crises that would be impossible for Western countries to solve through conventional diplomatic or military responses, while forcing fundamental changes in Western policies regarding sanctions, military support, and economic relationships. The domestic political consequences of Iran's oil shutdown began appearing within weeks as energy prices increased and supply shortages created economic hardship throughout Western countries. Gasoline prices increased 34% in the United States as Iranian supply disruption, combined with increased demand for American petroleum exports to allies facing energy shortages. Heating costs increased 67% in Germany as Iranian crude supply disruption forced utilities to purchase replacement fuel at premium prices while competing with other European countries for limited alternative supplies. Industrial production declined 12% in South Korea as energy-intensive manufacturing facilities reduced operations due to fuel shortages and increased energy costs. The economic impacts created political pressures that Iranian officials had anticipated and planned to exploit. American voters began questioning why their government was supporting Iranian protesters when such support contributed to domestic energy price increases that affected every American family. European politicians faced increasingly vocal domestic opposition to policies that supported Iranian human rights movements, while contributing to energy shortages and economic hardship for European citizens. Asian governments confronted public criticism about energy security policies that had made their countries vulnerable to Iranian supply disruptions. Iranian officials interpreted these domestic political reactions as evidence that their energy weapon strategy was succeeding in creating international pressure for policy changes that would benefit Iranian strategic objectives. But the most dangerous aspect of Iran's oil shutdown was the precedent it established for other countries, with significant energy resources to weaponize those resources for political objectives. If Iran could force international policy changes through oil supply disruption, then other energy exporters could use similar tactics to achieve their own strategic goals. Venezuela could shut down oil production to prevent international recognition of opposition political leaders. Saudi Arabia could restrict oil exports to influence American policies regarding regional conflicts. Russia could expand natural gas supply disruptions to prevent European military aid to Ukraine. The proliferation of energy weapon tactics could create a world where energy security depended more on political relationships than commercial arrangements, and where energy supplies could be eliminated without warning whenever exporting countries faced domestic political pressures or international policy disputes. The intelligence community assessment concluded that Iran's oil shutdown represented a new form of economic warfare that exploited Western dependence on global energy markets while avoiding the military responses that would be triggered by conventional attacks on energy infrastructure. This wasn't sabotage that could be prevented through military protection of critical facilities. This wasn't terrorism that could be deterred through improved security measures. This was sovereign government decision-making that used legitimate authority over national resources to achieve geopolitical objectives through economic coercion. Western countries faced the unprecedented challenge of responding to economic attacks that were conducted through legal government actions rather than illegal military operations. Traditional defensive strategies designed to protect energy infrastructure were useless against energy exporters who chose to shut down their own production for strategic purposes. But perhaps the most disturbing long-term implication of Iran's energy weapon was the possibility that successful economic coercion would encourage expansion to other critical resources and supply chains that Western countries depended upon for economic security. If Iranian oil shutdown forced Western policy changes regarding sanctions and political support, then Iran might apply similar tactics to natural gas exports, agricultural products, or mineral resources. Other countries might follow Iranian example by weaponizing their own resource exports for political leverage. The result could be systematic fragmentation of global supply chains, as countries discovered that economic interdependence created strategic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by adversaries willing to accept economic costs for political advantages. The intelligence assessment warned that Iran's energy weapon represented the beginning of a new era of international competition where economic warfare capabilities would be more important than military capabilities for achieving strategic objectives, and where control over critical resources would determine which countries maintained sovereignty and which countries became economically dependent on more strategically sophisticated competitors. The empty oil terminals at Karg Island, where tankers once loaded Iranian crude for global distribution, serve as monuments to the moment when energy exports became weapons of mass economic destruction, capable of forcing political changes in countries thousands of miles away from the wells that produced the oil. The shutdown valves that stop the flow of 2.3 million barrels daily represent more than maintenance procedures or safety protocols. They represent the transformation of energy infrastructure into strategic weapons that can devastate enemy economies while avoiding the military retaliation that would follow conventional attacks. Iranian officials sitting in Tehran conference rooms while global energy markets collapsed had discovered that in an interconnected world, controlling critical resources provided more leverage over international politics than controlling military forces or diplomatic relationships. The success or failure of Iran's energy weapon will determine whether the 21st century witnesses the emergence of resource-based international competition where countries compete for control over critical supplies rather than military superiority or economic efficiency. The $1.2 trillion worth of Iranian petroleum reserves that disappeared from global markets in 18 hours represents more than lost energy supplies. It represents the weaponization of interdependence that had been assumed to create mutual benefits and shared prosperity. The protesters in Iranian streets who demanded political change inadvertently triggered the deployment of an economic weapon that could reshape international relations for decades while demonstrating that in a globalized world, domestic political instability in resource-rich countries could threaten the economic security of every nation that depended on international energy markets. Iran's oil shutdown succeeded in protecting the regime from immediate overthrow while creating international crises that would provide leverage for future negotiations about sanctions relief and political recognition. But it also established precedents for resource warfare that could destabilize the global economy whenever resource-rich countries face domestic political pressures or international policy disputes. The revolution that Iranian protesters sought to create in their own country ended up creating a revolution in international economic relationships that will define energy security and resource politics for the next generation of global competition.